Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with another Blender tutorial. We're going to look at something kind of different today. We're going to venture away from the film project that we've been working on. There's still a couple more tutorials to do for that to complete that concept. But I wanted to move on to some other ideas and some newer territory. For the most part, we've been recycling a lot of things that we already know how to do, things that we've covered maybe even years ago on this channel. But I wanted to spend some time here looking at some newer ideas, some things that we really haven't spent time on before, things that we haven't even really talked about before. Now, it may some of these ideas may touch on things that we've covered, but hopefully we're going to be pushing into some new territory and some different ways to function with Blender. What I was thinking about was the ways in which I am heavily influenced by a lot of other tutorial series that are out there by some people that, of course, we all know, on other proprietary platforms, mostly on compositing software. A lot of those tutorials influence me quite a bit in terms of the artistic output that I'm trying to make. The ways that these compositing tutorials teach you to use layers to composite artistically to get a particular sort of outcome are very, very helpful, have always been very helpful to me in using Blender, particularly in the OpenGL sense that I tend to use it, rather than the ray-traced render engine sense that most people look at Blender. Just so that we can understand sort of what I'm talking about here, I can show you some examples of sources. So if we hop over to a web browser here, of course, a large influence is Andrew Kramer and his Video Copilot tutorial series that he's been doing for years now. And he touches on a lot of different things. There's some After Effects only sorts of tutorials where you're just using After Effects compositing software to create these kind of motion graphic sort of images and some visual effects. He also has a line of products. Some of them are element products that have pre-recorded elements that you can use for compositing fire and smoke and particles and things of that nature. He also has a plug-in software that goes with After Effects called Element 3D, which of course I'm sure we know about pretty well by this point. And Element 3D is an OpenGL game engine based layer for the After Effects compositor that can generate OpenGL game engine sorts of renderings of three-dimensional objects and place them into two-dimensional space. So you can generate these elements, which is why it's called Element. You can generate an element inside of a 3D sort of plug-in program and then use that as a two-dimensional layer in the compositor within After Effects and create more three-dimensional effects using that. So he has a series of tutorials on that. And then, of course, he has a number of other kind of offshoot tutorials that don't necessarily have to do with After Effects but touch on some other software programs such as Photoshop and I think even some Nuke stuff in there as well. Now, this is really useful to us in the Blender community. Mostly you would think because of the Element 3D software, the 3D compositing plugin that he has made. Because, of course, Blender is 3D and it has OpenGL capability to render very quickly. But that's not necessarily the limit of the usefulness of these tutorials. Blender actually has quite a capable two-dimensional 2D compositing capability in two different avenues. One of them being the compositor, the node compositor itself, that we usually use to render or put our render passes through to put them together in our final output. Also in the video sequence editor, we refer to as the VSE, but the VSE is supposed to be a video editor where you can edit and trim and cut video portions together to essentially cut a movie or cut a film or put your final cut together. It's a very, very robust editing platform with layered strips, much like After Effects. But it also has some very, very useful compositing tools as well. So in a sense, you can use the video sequence editor as a compositor, a 2D strip compositor, a layer compositor, much like After Effects. And I'm going to show you just how far we can push this, because if you just think about Blender in a different way, you can sort of apply the functions of After Effects and some other proprietary software programs like HitFilm. HitFilm website is over here with some tutorials as well. HitFilm is kind of a lower budget version of After Effects. But you can sort of figure out the relationship between some of the functions of Blender and the functions of these compositing applications and do the same things. You can accomplish really the same kinds of effects and artistic layout with very similar functions, and some of it can even be very procedural, and that when you edit something very far up the chain or far back on the chain, it will affect everything in the chain. Some other places where we find tutorials that are inspirational besides these two, Red Giant software has a lot of software applications that they sell, and they have a tutorial series on those applications and ways to use them in various different platforms, mostly in After Effects. But Red Giant software is another very, very good resource, particularly for particle effects using trap code. And of course, Blender has a particle engine as well, so that can be very applicable. Another one would be over here at the Foundry, some Nuke tutorials. And this is more node-based compositing, but of course, concepts that you find here can be very applicable to the node compositor in Blender. Now, the node compositor in Blender suffers one major limitation, in that it doesn't do live playback, as far as I know. I haven't really paid much attention to it in quite a while, but the node compositor in Blender does have that limitation, whereas the video sequence editor does do some live playback with a little bit of limitation. If you can just kind of downsize your resolution a little bit, you can get pretty close to live playback in the VSE. Another place, of course, are some other independent sorts of channels that you can find. One of them that everyone knows is Film Riot, with these tutorials that they make up, usually dealing with sketch comedy related to their show that they do, a weekly show. And then some short films, and they deal a lot with visual effects, more so than graphic design. But they will apply a lot of things that you see in some of these other tutorial websites like Video Copilot and Red Giant. In fact, they, of course, know these people and collaborate with them very, very frequently. But a lot of great ideas that you can get there, not only in software, but also with respect to just filmmaking in general, and using hardware and cameras and various filmmaking techniques. So, these are very inspirational places that you can find inspiration for projects. And just because they don't use Blender doesn't mean you can't apply what they teach inside of Blender, and that's going to be the focus of what we're doing here. So let's take a look here very quickly at some ideas. These are just a couple of little projects that I whipped out very quickly here, just a few seconds on each clip, and they are very similar to some sorts of design projects that we find in Andrew Kramer's Video Copilot website. Now, the interesting thing about all of these is that they were made in Blender, and they were all made in a single pass, so one render pass. Not merely using OpenGL techniques, but using the video sequencer as the compositor. And there's a way in which we can do that, where we can take OpenGL live passes from the viewport, and then through the scene strip function in the VSE, we can actually layer up various scenes from various kinds of projects within a Blender file to composite them all together. We can also do a lot of interesting things that are very procedural, such as on this example right here, this first one. I could change the text at the very beginning of the chain, and it would apply to all of the various scenes that are being piped into the video sequence editor, and thereby making it procedural. So I can save the file away and then I can reuse it again and again with different text and different words. This one here is very similar. However, it's using a pre-rendered pass for the this little animation here on the word glitch. Again, this is an idea that came from Andrew Kramer's website. Now, what I did is I sort of reasoned that inside of Blender, the equivalent of pre-composition that you find in the After Effects compositor is really just a render pass, a quick render pass. So pre-composing something is merely just running it through and into RAM. And that, I believe, that's really all that all that After Effects does when it pre-composes something. So we can do the very similar thing here, where we take one element, which would be this glitch animation, and very quickly render that one pass out into a video file. Because it's only one text element and it's stationary, there's no camera movement, there's no ray tracing going on, we can render it very, very quickly. It doesn't even have to be at full resolution because it's not going to be showing up full screen. So we can kind of match the idea of pre-composition by just rendering out a pass. That being said, we don't usually need to do that. We can usually just take a scene element and run it through the video sequence editor scene strip function and take it live right out of the scene without having to render it out. So only in very special circumstances do we need to take that extra step, which removes a little bit of the ease of changing elements further up the chain. Another example down here would be this one, which is a text, motion graphics sort of design. And this is just 3D text inside of Blender. But one thing you'll notice is that it has some motion blur applied to it. Now, I've talked at great length in the past about motion blur and ways to create motion blur, and my kind of version of motion blur for OpenGL elements, where you're using oversampling to generate it. Now that, in the past, as I've talked about it, usually requires us to render a couple of passes before we composite it. Now what I found is that using the scene strip function in multiple scenes, we can actually accomplish this in one pass without having to render out all of our samples. We can allow Blender to pick and choose only the layered samples that we need in the video sequence editor and create motion blur. So I'm going to show you how to do that. We may not touch on that in this tutorial, but these are the things that we're going to be looking at as we go forward. So just kind of really clever ways to use the various operations of Blender and putting them together to get one final single composite render without having to do a bunch of intermediate renders. So with that being said, let's start a project here, and we'll deal with some of the basic concepts here at the beginning. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to delete our default cube. We're not going to need that. We're not going to need the light either. Let's move our camera to the top view. And we'll align our active camera to that view, so it should be centered on the top. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to create multiple scenes, and what we want to do in Blender is we're going to treat these scenes as if they are separate compositions, just as you would have in an After Effects project. So an After Effects project would have multiple compositions for various elements that are being used. Then those compositions are pre-composed down to their own strip, which then that strip is layered inside of a final composite and put together in your final project. So each scene will represent a strip or an element that can then be put together in the video sequence editor, okay, if that makes sense. Now, in doing this, we want to be very thorough in our labeling. And we want to be very logical and very thoughtful about what we need and what we don't need. Okay, so on this very first one, we're going to start at the very bare bones of our project. We're going to need a text element. So what we'll do is we'll just pump our resolution up to 100% for this, and we're going to add some text. Now we're going to keep this simple on this first little go around here. we're going to use white text, and we're going to be using add blend mode, transfer modes in the video sequence editor. So we're not going to really need to use lights for anything. We're going to just be using the add blend mode with white text. And if we want it to be a different color, we can use that white text to affect some kind of a color layer as a matte or a mask. That'll make more sense if we do that later on, but for right now, we're just going to use some white text. So let's get a better font here very quickly. So let's come down to our font settings here, and we'll navigate to our fonts. So I'm in Linux here, and I don't have all my fonts together apart from my operating system. Go to the true type fonts, and I believe I have the Microsoft Office font somewhere in here. I think I do. MS, there we go, Microsoft. Now, something very interesting, I don't know if you know this about Blender, but if you click on the display mode up here for thumbnails, it actually will show you what the fonts look like. Just as it does for video or images, it will show you what those are kind of in a thumbnail view. Blender does the same for fonts, which is very, very useful. So let's use the, we'll use Georgia Bold. Let's do that. So Georgia Bold. And we'll open that up. And that's what our text is going to be. Let's get our text centered. We're going to center the text. We'll scale it up. We're going to want this to fill the frame. And we'll also use the offset function here to get it our origin spot a little bit more into the center of the text. -2.5. Let's see. That's pretty close. Go back to 2. And that looks good right there. Let's tab into the edit mode here, and we'll add some text. So we'll just put a logo on that, and we'll tab back out, scale it down a little bit. So here's our text. Now we're going to want to leave a little bit of space on the edges because we're probably going to add some compositing tricks to this to blur it a little bit. I'll show you how to do that. So right now we are in our scene with our text. We need to give our text some color here. Before we go any further, we want to make sure that we're using GLSL shading mode because everything is going to be using OpenGL rendering. We're not going to be using the Blender internal to render anything on this project. We also want to turn on the texture viewport shading. We will add a material. This material needs to be white. As I was saying before, everything's going to be white because we're going to be using the add blend mode, transfer modes. And we want to make it shadeless. So no lights in this at all. Now, because we're going to be using add transfer modes, one thing that we can do is we can just set a background mode to black. We don't have to render these passes with transparency because we're going to be adding them on. And that'll just make things a little bit easier. However, that being said, you can use scene elements using transparency beyond the element if you set your shading down here in your render settings from sky to transparent. Right now we're going to leave it as sky so that we're going to pick up the black background and we can turn on our world background and only render, and this is what our output looks like. So procedurally from here, all I ever need to do is tab into the edit mode for the text, and I can change the text to something else. You can see how this can work. So if I wanted to do a corporate logo or something like that, I could edit it. I could change my spacing here. So Blender has quite a toolkit for text. If I wanted to make it three-dimensional, of course, there's a lot of other functions for that, but this is going to be a 2D effect. So I can procedurally change my text, and then down the chain with what we're going to be doing, it will automatically be updated. So let's change that back here very quick. Logo. And I'll take my spacing back down. So that looks good. So here's our text, and this is what we're going to be using as a text element. From here now, what we need to do is we want to make a couple of versions of this text. So let's think about the project. We're going to make this text floating in space with a floor plane underneath it. And we need to have a reflection of the text in the ground. And we also need to have a blurred version of the text that will be used as an additional ground reflection. And that blurred version of the text can actually be used for a couple of other things. We could use it for a glow effect on the text. We could also use that blurred version for some floor glow, some sort of I don't know, some diffuse sorts of reflection on the ground. So what we're going to do is we're going to make 3 passes of this text. One will look like this, one will be blurred, and then one will have a bit of a modification that will help it to appear more like a reflection. Now this is the only pre-rendering that we're going to do, but we're going to render 1 frame. Only 1 frame, and that is about as procedural as we can get, at least with this project. By rendering just 1 frame, we can use then those frames later on in our project to composite together those single images to create our project. So let's do that. We're going to call this one text. Then what I want to do is I want to duplicate this exact same project. However, what I want to do is I want to do it in such a way that the text, if edited in one place, will change in all of the others. So if you look up here in terms of our scene, our new scene options, if I hit the plus sign here, I can create a new scene. There's a few options. One of them is just new. One is copy settings. One is link objects. Another one is link object data. And then the last one is full copy. Now, if I make a full copy, it will make another instance of everything that's in the scene, but it will not be connected. If I change it in one, it will not change it for the other. If I put in link object data, what it will do is it will make another version of it, but it will make the data link together. Okay? If I click on link objects, what it will do is it will make another scene that has the same objects in it. Okay, so that if I move an object in one scene, it will move the object in the other scene. However, in the other aspects of the Blender project, it will not change anything about that scene, only what is happening within that viewport scene. Okay, if that makes sense. So what I want to do is I want to click on this, link objects, and I'm going to make another scene. I'm going to call this text reflect. Then I'm going to hit it again, and I'm going to hit link objects. And I'm going to call this one, actually, let me go back just to be a little bit more correct. We'll go back to the original one, and I'll hit link objects. And I'm going to call this one text blur. Okay, so I have these 3 versions of the scene. Now, if I look over here to my outliner, I have a text scene here, a text blur, which has all the same things. See, the camera is still camera, the text is still text. And then I have one down here, text reflect, which has all those objects in it as well. So the camera is the same, the text is the same, everything is the same. Now, the cool thing about this is that if I go to my first one, and I tab into edit mode for my text, and I change this, testing, okay, tab out, and I go now to my other scenes, you can see that my text has updated. My text has changed for all of them. So it's procedural. Now, the really neat thing about this is I can change the resolution on my cameras. Now, you might ask, why would you do that? Why would you want to do that? Well, if I want to edit that text in some way in the video sequence editor within its own chain, I would want to have the resolution changed so that I don't have to use other effects with such high processing power. Let me show you what I mean here. This first one we're going to leave alone. The second one, let's go to the text reflect. And on this one, I'm going to go to my camera. And on my camera, I want to set my resolution output to a much lower value. We're going to set it down to 10%. So this is going to now render at 10%. Now, if I render one frame in OpenGL at 10%, you can see how blocky it is. I don't need to have full resolution to do what we're going to do here. Okay, so let's now take this one step further and add an effect to that. We're going to go now to the video editor, the video sequence editor. And I want to make sure I'm still in my same scene, so text reflect. Blender has this intuitive thing where it assumes what you're going to be doing, and when you click on a different editing suite, a different editing portion of the suite, like the video editor or the 3D editor, it will assume that you want to go back to your original scene or the last scene that you were at when you were in that. Now in this case we don't want to do that, so we hit video editing and then we need to select the scene that we want to be in. Just as a point of organization, I like to set this here, this window, which is set to the graph editor automatically. I like to set this one to properties so I can see my render output. It's just the way I like to work, so it's something I do by default. What I want to do here is I'm going to bring in a scene strip. I'll click Add. And if I come up here to Scene, it gives me the 3 scenes that I have. Now I want to bring in my Text Reflect scene. That's the one that I'm in. And you can see that we're at a very low resolution. Now you see how it's gray. Automatically, by default, the presentation here of the scene strip is a solid viewport shading. I want this to be set to texture viewport shading, and what this is doing is it's giving me viewport OpenGL rendering. Now this is really, really useful for what we're going to be doing, except that it does not have any of the screen space compositing properties that we use in the viewport. So I can't do depth of field and I can't do any screen space ambient occlusion in here. I have to find some other ways to use that inside of the VSE. But otherwise it will render kind of the bare bones OpenGL function. One other thing that it doesn't do is it does not do anti-aliasing. Even though it could upconvert a scene in another video sequence editor project at full resolution, it will not do anti-aliasing. You're stuck with the blocking that you have. Now that isn't going to be a problem because what we're going to do is we're going to apply a blur effect to this. So if we click Add, we go to Effect Strip and we select Gaussian Blur. What I want to do is I want to make this streak up and down. Again, this takes a lot more to talk about than it does to do it. I want to make this streak up and down kind of on the y-axis there. So I'm going to come down to the strip settings, and for the first size, which is I believe the x-axis, I'm just going to set this to 1, and maybe I'll set it to 2. And then for the y-axis, I'm going to set this to 5. So I get this kind of up and down streak, this upward motion, okay? And this will be a little bit more similar to what we would find in a reflection. Now, this is going to be reversed. It's going to be flipped upside down when we render it out. In fact, if I want to do that, I can do it right now. I could just go to my text reflect layer, and on that, if I want to just get it in the proper proportion, I can flip it on the y-axis and it will automatically have that set for me. Now, the next thing I want to do is maybe add an effect where I have a little bit of a fade out effect on the downward edge of this. So that's something you would see in a reflection. So I'm going to composite that in here. We'll go down here and add another effect strip. We're going to add a color. And I don't even need to do that because we're gonna render out only 1 frame, so that wasn't necessary. We'll duplicate that color. The second color I'm going to set to white. Then I'm going to select both of these, hit Shift and select both, and then I'm going to go to my effect strip again. I'm going to select a wipe effect, and then I'm going to come down here. I'm going to turn off the default fade, and then I'm going to turn this up to about halfway. Then I'm going to turn on my blur width and turn it up as far as I can. Maybe move this down a little bit more. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of these. So hit box select and select all 3 of those. And I'm going to make them a meta strip. And I'll move them down on the x-axis. And then I'm going to take this and I'm going to play around with a couple of options here. One is that I can set this to the multiply blend mode. And what it will do is it will bring forward on the white the layer that is underneath it, and then it will leave the rest to black. So it gives me this kind of black fall off, this fade out on the bottom edge, which is a little bit more realistic. So I can play around with these settings until I get the kind of reflectivity that I want it to look like. Maybe I'll move this up to 10. That might be a little too much. Maybe we'll take it back down to about 8. So, I like the way this is looking. We'll call that done. So this is going to be my reflection pass. Okay. Let's go to another one. So we'll go back to the default viewport here, and we'll go to our text blur. Now we're going to make one for this as well. So let's set this resolution way down to about 5 pixels. Or 5% rather. And we're going to go now to the video editing for this, and you can see it jumps us back to the last video sequence editor project we were in, but we want to be in text blur. We're going to add that scene now, so we're going to add the text blur scene. Again, we want to set this to texture viewport shading. And I want to add to this another Gaussian blur. And on this Gaussian blur, we'll crank this up quite a bit. We'll set it maybe to 20% and 20%. And that looks pretty good. Now, one thing is I want to make sure that I don't clip off my blur effect out here. And it looks like I'm coming pretty close to that, so maybe we'll just set it down to 15%. So we're well within the bounds of our camera. Now, one thing I do on this is because it kind of darkens it up so much. One thing we can do is we can add an adjustment layer. And on the adjustment layer, we can change the multiply value to 2, and it'll brighten it up a little bit so you can just see it a little bit more clear. We can change that later on down the pipe whenever we use this layer later on. So that will be our blur layer. Now what I need to do is I just need to render out single frames for each one of these. So before we go any further, let's save this. We'll save this as a project here. Carl Blender Projects. We'll create a new folder. We'll call this VSE Tricks. And inside of VSE Tricks, we'll save this as Untitled. Will be fine for now. Let's render out these frames very quickly. So we'll go back to our default view, and we'll go to the original text view here, the very first one, which is set at full resolution. And just to prove the point very quickly, if I tab into edit mode and I change this to logo, tab back out. If I go now to my video editors and I hit this little button here, refresh sequencer, you will see that it updates now. Now it's set outside of the bounds of our camera here, so we would want to edit some of that. But you can see that now it says logo. If I go to my other one, my text reflect, I get the exact same thing, logo. So this is procedural. If I change the text in one place, then I have everything updated in all the other places. So I can set up my project file, I can save it off and use it over and over again. Let's go back and change that back though. So I don't even remember what we said here at the beginning. What was our original text? I don't know. I can't remember. There we go. Okay, so hello is what we're going to do. Let's render out this frame very quickly. So we're going to click on this button right here to render one single OpenGL frame. This is the frame that we're going to have. We come down here to image. We're going to hit save as image. We're going to save it into our folder here, VSE Tricks. Now, one thing that you might want to do, and let me undo this for a second. I have found that I will mistakenly hit the other render button because I've used it so much in my time with Blender, and I'll start rendering out a movie. And that can be very silly because right now it's by default set to render PNG files, so it would render a bunch of frames in my folder. So one thing I like to do is just set this to AVI JPEG to start with. If I want to do if I want to render transparency, what I will do is I will set this to one of the QuickTime versions that uses PNG, so that if I accidentally render that button, it'll render out an MOV file, one file that I can delete, rather than put up a bunch of images in my folder and really mess me up. So just a little food for thought there. So set this to AVI JPEG. Let's render off one frame. We don't need to set any render output here because we're just going to save the render output frame. We're going to save this as an image in this folder. We'll call this text. And then we will go to our other scene layers here. So we'll go to Text Reflect, click Refresh Sequencer, so we have everything reset to where we want it to be. And I will do the same thing again. I'm going to use these buttons up here. Now, when we're rendering video sequence editor scene strips, we have to use the OpenGL render buttons. If we use the internal render buttons, it will actually try to render that scene first and then put it into the video sequence editor. Okay, and that's a very useful function, don't get me wrong, but that's not what we're doing here. We just want to render the OpenGL version so it's very, very quick. So I render one frame. You can see how fast this happens. We'll save this one as text reflect. So this is the only pre-rendering we're doing. We're creating these single image elements that we can then use in a scene later on. And then we'll go to the other one, text blur. So this is like the pre-composition of that you find. Hit refresh sequencer so it says the right thing. I think we're good. And I will hit the render button over here. Again, you want to make sure you set things to AVI JPEG. So I might have botched that up here. And text blur. So one of those is a PNG. We're not going to worry about that though. Okay, so there we have it. So a procedural way to create some elements for text for a project. Let's go back to the 3D view, default view, and we're going to make a new scene altogether, a new scene. And then in this scene, we want to add some elements to it. We need to get a camera in there, so let's add a camera. We'll turn off our only render. We want to make sure we're set to GLSL. Turn up our resolution. Let's go to the front view. We will align the active camera to that view. We'll move this up on Z-space. And let's start putting together a scene. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to bring in our text element. So let's do that. We will come up here to File, and we're going to import images as planes. And this is a very, very useful add-on that you want to make sure you have enabled. So we'll click on that, and we're going to grab our text image. And one thing I wanted to do is I wanted to make sure that that was shadeless. We can just turn that on now. And then let's position this in space. So we will move it up. And we want this to be relatively close to the floor plane so that we can get a really, really clean reflection on it. We'll scale it up from there. So we'll position it right about there. Nice and close. And then let's bring in the reflection. Same thing. Bring in the reflection. Click shadeless on this one. And we'll scale it up as well. So it's the same relative scale. And we'll move it down so it's sitting just below the floor plane. And this is where Blender, has the problems in the viewport, is that it doesn't do compositing very well right in the viewport without doing a lot of tricks. You can do a lot of compositing in the viewport using transparency, as you've seen on a lot of my tutorials. But this is going to get beyond the bounds of the, what we're going to do is going to go beyond the bounds of the viewport capabilities. So we're going to have to use the video sequence editor. We're just positioning things right now. And then we'll bring in another one. Bring in our blur. Also shadeless. Scale it up. Now we want this to be essentially the same place as the one on the bottom. Now the one on the bottom is flipped, it's reversed, so we're going to take this blur one, we're going to rotate on the x-axis 180 degrees. So now it's upside down like the one on the bottom. We're going to line this up so that it's in position down here. And then we're going to make a couple more copies of this, at least one more. Duplicate the blur. And we'll rotate it on the x-axis 90 degrees. We'll bring this up so it's sitting kind of at the floor plane. Right above it, right there. And it's sitting underneath. And I'm going to take this one and I'm going to scale it on the y-axis quite a bit. And I'll scale it in a little bit on the x-axis, just a little bit. Then I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to scale this one on the y-axis and bring it back out on the x-axis just a little bit past where we were before. Scale it on y a little bit more. Okay, so I now have everything I need with respect to the text. One last thing I might do is I might go to my hello text, my original text, and I can do a little bit of a compositing trick right here inside of the video, right inside of the viewport. If I go to the texture settings here, and I go to another texture slot, and I add another one, I can open up my text blur image that I've already created, and then what I want to do is I'm going to set this to blend and add blend mode, so it's added on top, and then I'm going to take the color influence way down. We're going to take it down to 0.1 and just see where that gets us real quick. So I can get a very faint kind of glow on it. That's a cheap way to get a glow right away. I could do it this way, or I could have, make it its own layer another way. We'll look at some ways to do some really creative kinds of animation, maybe in some other tutorials down the road. But this is one way to get a glow on that very quickly. Maybe I'll even set that a little bit lower, 0.05. So we just get a little bit of an essence of a glow on that. Okay. Now, what I want to do is I can either set these to have a particular kind of transfer mode right now so I can see everything properly in the scene, or I can ignore that because we're compositing white on black using add transfer modes in the VSE. I don't really need to deal with transparency at all. I might deal with transparency a little bit when I deal with some of this floor reflection. But really for this project, what we're doing right now, we don't really need to do that. What we need to do is we need to get everything separated into its own kind of layer. But we have one more element to make. We need to get a ground. We need to get a floor here that will kind of look like a wet, damp floor. And I've made an image already to do this. So we're going to go up here and hit the Import Images as Planes option again. Let me see if I can find that. I have a texture already created. Looks like this, grime. And we'll import that. And let's rotate this on the x-axis 90 degrees so it's flat. Scale it way up. So this is going to be, it's kind of like a tile with some grayscale blotches on it. We'll scale this up to be the floor. And then what I want to do is I'm going to go into the texture slot for this object, and I'm going to increase the repeat mapping on it. So we'll turn this up to 5 on the X and Y. So now it's tiled, so it repeats over and over and over again. Okay, so that's good. So this is my scene. This is everything that I need. The only thing that's missing now is that the camera, I don't have a proper camera move. So why don't we make a camera move right now while we're thinking about it? We'll go back to the viewport, back to the camera view, and we'll kind of set up a camera move very quickly. So let's take the camera and we will give it kind of a left to right pass. We'll move it on the x-axis to the left. And we'll rotate it on the z-axis right. Maybe we'll move it down on the z-axis a little bit. So we have a starting point for our animation. We'll insert a location rotation. And then we'll just make this 120 frames. This is going to be a long tutorial, no doubt about it. But once you get into the hang of what we're doing here, you can move pretty efficiently. Let's move this now over on the x-axis to the right. We'll rotate it on the z-axis. And maybe we'll move it in on the y-axis a little bit. Move it up. Let's move it up on the z-axis. Rotate down on the x. Rotate down on the y. So get a good ending spot there, and we'll insert a location rotation keyframe. And actually, let's move this down on Z space a little bit. Good. Now what we want to do is we want to go to the graph editor real quick and just kind of clean up our move, our camera move. We're going to hit V. And then select vector so it's a straight curve, and now this is our camera move. Very, very smooth kind of camera move. we don't like smooth camera moves. We like to have some motion. So let's add a little bit of noise to this. We'll go to the rotation slot. So select the X rotation. Go to the modifiers. We'll add a noise modifier. And let's just so we can see our curve here. That's a lot of noise. Let's move this out. I find that like 12 is a good number for the top there. And 0.02. So if we go back to the beginning of this animation, we can watch our X rotation a little bit. And let's go to the Y, add a modifier noise, same settings, 12, 0.02. But we're going to offset it here a little bit. We'll change the seed by quite a bit so that they're not exactly the same curves. And then we'll add one for the Z. 12, 0.02. We'll go the other direction. So here's our camera move. It might be a little too jumpy. Let's make this 0.01. We just want it to be subtle. And let's try that again. Yeah. I think that looks good. All right, so we'll call that good. We might take our floor plane and scale it down just a little bit so we can see a little bit more of our grit and grime in there. All right, very good. Let's call this original scene. So now that we have our whole scene put together, we need to make duplications of the scene so that we can separate out all of our elements. There's a lot of different ways to do this. Again, we can make a new scene and then copy items over. Probably the easiest thing to do is just to duplicate the scene exactly as it is. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on this. And we're going to hit link objects together. So we're going to link objects and do this for the text. We'll do it for the glow, reflective glow. We'll do it for the floor. We'll do it for the floor glow reflection. And then we'll do it for the reflection. So what we end up with is 5 separate scenes, which are copies of the original scene. Okay. Now what we want to do is that on each one of these, we only want to maintain the elements that we actually need. The good news about doing this and copying the scene exactly is that it has all of the elements of the scene already copied over in terms of the length of the project and the resolution and everything is copied over exact. When you create a new scene, you don't have that copy. So let's go up here to the scene 1, original scene 1, and we're going to rename this. We're going to call this text strip. And what we're going to do is inside of the text strip scene is we're going to delete the things we don't need. We need the camera. We need the text, the original text. We do not need the text blur, so we're going to delete that. Now if you look here, the text blur is missing from here in the text strip scene, but if we go to the original scene, we still have the text blur in it. Okay, so that won't delete it. Now, if we were to change a setting on the text blur in here, it would have changed the setting in all other scenes, which is what makes this procedural. That's kind of the nice thing about doing it this way, is that you change something one place, it changes it everywhere else, and that's a good way to work. We don't need anything else except for the camera and the text, so we're just going to take all of these elements here, and we're going to delete them. So we are in text. Make sure we're in the right scene. That's very, very important. Text, reflect, and grime. Okay, so we have that one done. Let's make another one here. Go to original scene 2. We're going to call this reflection strip. And in reflection strip, we're going to keep only the text reflect and the camera. So we'll delete all the other things. Text blur 1, text blur 2. Going to keep text reflect, and we're going to get rid of that floor plane. Okay, and we have our background is set to black already. We set that in the world setting, so when we do this as a add transfer mode, everything will look good. And then let's go to another one. So we have our text, we have our reflection. Let's go to original scene 3. We'll call this, I'm putting strip at the end of everything that we want to keep as a composite strip. Let's call this floor strip. This is actually going to be a mask, is the way it's going to be used. So in floor strip, we want to keep the camera. We don't want the text. We don't want the text blur. Don't want text blur 2. We don't want the text reflect. We just want the grime, floor grime. And so we've got the text, we've got the reflection, we've got the floor grime. Let's go to original scene number 4. And on this one, we'll call this glow strip. And in glow strip, we want to get rid of the text. We want to get rid of the floor. We want to get rid of the reflection. We want to get rid of the blur. We want to keep these two elements right here. Now what I've done is I've set these in the interim here. You missed this. I set one of these to a different mode, an object mode. I set one of them to X-ray so it shines through the other one. And then I also went to the game engine. And for this one, I set the material to add blend mode. So I can see both of them together at the same time. So one has transparency. It is in front of the other one all the time, and it's being added onto it. And that will keep our elements put together. So when I go to the camera view here, you can see that I can see both of those elements when I select the camera in that scene. Okay, let's go to another one here. We need to do one more scene. So we've got everything except for the blur reflection. So if we go to scene number 5, we're going to call this blur reflect strip. And in this one, we don't need, make sure we select the right scene, we don't need the text. We don't need the blur 1. We don't need blur 2. We don't need the text reflect. We don't need the grime. Again, you can copy these different ways. I just found that this was a little bit easier because it maintains settings in place already. Now you can have cameras doing all kinds of different things, separate cameras with different animations, and then composite all of that together too. That's the benefit of this. So we're all set now. Our resolution is 100%. It's debatable whether you want to change this. I've done tests where I change this resolution to 110% so that it kind of down converts a little bit to deal with a little bit of the anti-aliasing that it can't do in the video sequence editor using scene strips. Let's not worry about that right now, though. Let's go to a final composite. We're going to do the final composite in the original scene layer here. So we'll select original scene, and then we're going to go to the video editor, and we want to make sure we're in original scene. And from here, we'll add some scene strips. So let's start from the background and work our way to the foreground. So the background most strip is going to be the reflection. So we want to go to the reflection strip, this one right here. And as long as our preview is set to texture mode, we will see an OpenGL render of that scene. So this is actually showing us the scene through the camera that's there. And if I were to change that element, it would automatically update in our project. Okay? I'll show you how procedural this is in a moment. Once we get through all of this, I'll show you how we can change our text and it will update everything automatically. Let's now go to another one. So the next thing we need is our floor plane. Let's add our floor strip. And now we can see our floor strip is in there. I'm actually going to turn this one off for the moment. Actually, before I do that, let's edit this a little bit to make it a little bit more contrasted. So let's add a curves adjustment in there. And we're going to bring the whites back a little bit and bring the darks in quite a bit. So the white places is where we're going to see... I might want to invert this, actually. Yeah, no, this is fine. So the white places is where we're going to see the very, very stark, or rather the very, very blurry reflection. And then the dark places is where we're going to see into the very clean reflection that's underneath it. This is going to be kind of like the dark parts are where there's water in the scene. So we'll increase this contrast quite a bit. up the whites a little bit. And now what I can do is I can turn the strip off. It's actually going to be a mask. It's going to be a mask for this strip. We'll add to that the blur reflect strip. And what I want to do is I want to set this to alpha over in our blend mode. And then in the modifier stack, I'm going to add a mask. And for the mask, I'm going to select my floor strip. And you can see what's going on there. This is awesome. Okay, do you see how this is now reflecting? It's putting a blurred reflection above my reflection in the floor. Now, if I want to change the way this looks, all I have to do is go to my floor strip, and I can change the contrast. Now, I might want my blurred reflection to be a little bit more subtle. So what I can do is in this, I can go to my modifier stack and add a curves adjustment, and I'll move my curves adjustment above the mask, and maybe I'll just darken it up a little bit so it's a little bit more subtle. So I can really see the contrast of the reflection and the kind of watery effect standing out a little bit better. Isn't that neat? Pretty good. So if I want this to play back very quickly, I can change my proxy render setting up here. We'll change it to 50%. So it will change my resolution in my viewport a little bit, but now it will update very, very quickly. Another thing that I can do is in my playback, I can turn on frame dropping. And if I was using audio, I would turn on AV sync and audio scrubbing. We're not doing that right now. But just by turning off the turning on frame dropping, when I play this back, it now will play in real time and just drop the frames that it's having a hard time rendering. I can also set the proxy even lower to, say, 25%. And now when I play this back, now it's playing back essentially real time, and I'm seeing everything in there. So that's pretty cool. Let's set this back up to 50% so we can see a little bit more what we want to see in our final composite. The next thing I would see is I would see my glow sitting on top of this. So this is the point at which this starts to look like After Effects. We're using layered strips, and each one of these scene strips resembles a pre-composed project that is inside of another separate scene. So let's go from here. We'll add to this another scene strip, which will be the glow strip. And again, I will set this to an add blend mode. And that's pretty stark, so I might actually set a modifier on that and put in a curves adjustment and darken it down just a little bit. Give us a little bit more contrast on that. And again, this is all white, so we can change the colors here in our composite using some adjustment layers. And then the last thing that we would have on here is the actual text strip. So we'll come up here and we'll put the text strip on top. And I will set this to an add blend mode as well. And here we have our final sort of bare bones composite. And if I play this back, we can see that it is playing back in real time with some frame dropping. If we set this down even further to 25%, it'll play back a little bit better. And we have the camera move and everything. It's all in there. Everything that we need is in that scene to make it look good. Now, some compositing issues. If I render out a frame of this, even if my proxy size is down to 25%, if I do an OpenGL frame, it will render it at full resolution, but you'll see the aliasing going on in here, this blockiness around the edge that isn't really being taken care of in the final composite. A few things we can do to try to address that. One thing is that we could go back to our scenes, each scene that we have here. So each one that says strip, I could set my resolution up a little bit. Let's say I set it to 110%. So that's the first one. We'll set another one to 110%. The glow strip, we'll set everything up just a little bit. We want this to be in the Blender internal render. 110. Original scene, we want to leave at 100. Reflection strip, we want that to be at 110. So our final composite is at 100%, but all these strips that are coming in are going to be set to 110. So they're going to be kind of down converted a little bit. So now if I go back to my video editor and I click refresh sequencer, now what it's doing is it should be bringing in all these other scenes at 110% render, but then it's down converting to 100. So if I do one frame there, we can see that the blockiness improves slightly because it's being down converted. Now, Anti-aliasing, if it is anything, bare bones, it is just a blurring effect. So one thing we could do here is we could add to this an adjustment layer. And then on this adjustment layer, we could add to that a blur, Gaussian blur. And on the Gaussian blur, we could set the size to 1.5, so just 1.5 pixel blur. And now this will render very quickly because we are at we're only using a very, very small amount. But if I render back a frame of that now, we can see that everything softens up quite a bit. In fact, I probably don't even want it to be 1.5. I could probably set that to just 1 pixel, and it might do enough for us. So I'll go back to the video sequence editor. We'll set this just to 1. And this can be just kind of a finished, polished blur that we add to it at the very end. Now, if I want to keep this effect together, I can go to my box selection here and go to the strip and make a meta strip. So now the input will come into that meta strip, into the adjustment layer, and then go to that blur. And I just move this down on the y-axis, and now I've got my final effect sitting out there in the end, affecting everything at the bottom. Now, the cool thing about this is I can move this up to the very top of the chain as I add other effects. So I could add some color correction and adjustment. In fact, let's do that very quickly. If I move this up on the y-axis, and we'll add another adjustment layer to this. And on this adjustment layer, let's say that we add a color curve. And we'll take the reds down. And we'll bring the reds up on the high end. And then we'll kind of crunch it a little bit on the low side. Maybe I'll just put a contrast on it. And because it's grayscale, that might not affect it very much. Let's see what we get. No, we get it. We get a little bit of color. So the darks kind of look a little bit more blue, and then the lights get a little bit more of a reddish kind of hue to them. So that's pretty good. I might want a little bit more blur on my text. So one thing I can do is I can go back to that layer where I have my text. So my text strip layer, which is the one I'm in, I can select that element, and if you remember on the texture slot, we had that blur texture set in there. Maybe I'll turn this up a little bit. Now this will affect it everywhere that this element exists. So this material will automatically be updated. 0.1. So I get a little bit more of a blur out of it, a little bit more of a glow. And then we'll go back to our video editor, and if I hit refresh sequencer, now I can see that everything has been updated, my color correction as well as my blurring effect. In fact, the glow might need to go up a little bit more because I added that color correction. So let's go back here to the default. Same thing. Maybe we'll increase this to 0.2. Maybe we'll go over the top a little bit, 0.3, make it really stand out. And we'll go back to the video editor and hit refresh sequencer, and now it stands out quite a bit more. So if I render that frame, this is the effect that we're getting. So we have our animation in there, we have our effects on the ground set in. I might want to brighten those up a little bit. Go back to our video sequence editor here, and maybe what we'll do is we'll take this floor plane and we'll brighten it up just a little bit. So we had a curve adjustment already on that, set above the mask. And that looks a little better. Maybe we want to have a little bit of a glow, an overhead glow in this. We'll move our adjustment layer up. And we'll add here very quickly a color. Now, this will render, I could do a wipe effect. Let me just show you how to do it real quick, but then I'll probably replace it with something a little bit more efficient. I'm going to add two colors here. One will be white, one is black. I select both. And then I will add to this a wipe effect. I'll turn off the default fade and refresh here so I can see it. And I'll set this to iris. Let me turn off these effects up here very quickly because I think they're causing us to update too much. So on my wipe effect, I will set the blur width up here. Turn back the fade amount. And then what I can do is on this wipe effect, I can use the crop functions and crop it on the top, and then on the right, and on the left. Now, I could use this as an overlay. The problem with it is that Blender is processing this wipe all the way along the chain. So what I might do is I might just render out one frame of this and then put that one frame on top. Alternatively, you can have elements pre-made, which is what I have here, just for this sort of thing. If I add here an image, and I go to, I have my lens flare elements from my lens flare pack. I have an image that looks a lot like that, this glow right here. And I'll set this end frame to 120, and I'll import it. And then I'll do the same thing. So I'm just going to use my crop functions to crop it on the top, on the right, and on the left. These probably should look kind of the same. There we go. And then on this, I might add a curves adjustment. And maybe we'll take the red channel and bump it up a little bit. Take the blues down, give it kind of a yellowish hue. And then for the blend mode, I'll set it to add. And I'll just take the opacity down to where I want it to be comfortably. Maybe even lower. So we get a little bit of a glow from overhead on that. Maybe I want some lens grit on that. I also have an image for that. So we'll do this one right here, set it to 120. And we'll add a curves adjustment to this as well. Take the blues up a little bit. Take the green. And the red's down. And we'll set this also to an add blend mode. And I might flip this on the y-axis, and then we'll decrease the opacity quite a bit. So it's just a very, very subtle kind of effect, maybe even lower than that, 0.3. Maybe even lower than that, 0.2. So something like that. And now if I turn on my adjustment layer, and then I turn on my blur, and if I refresh, now I've got a final composite. So I've got a bit of a glow, overhead glow on that. Additionally, if I wanted to get some chromatic aberration, I could do that as well. What I need to do is come down here to my text strip. Let's do this. We're going to take, again, we're going to take these things and turn them off up here real quick. Let's take everything above it. Box select everything here. Move it up on Y space. We'll try to do this right inside. Duplicate the strip. There we go. And do it again. Now on the first one, I'm going to set this to cross for a second. On the first one, I want to make this kind of a red color. So we'll go to the modifier stack, and on the curves, we'll add a curve adjustment, and we'll take the reds, take the blues. Actually, we'll do it subtractively. Take the blues down. Actually, we'll take the blues all the way down and take the greens all the way down. So we have red only. Then on the strip cropping function here, we'll crop this on the left side about 5 pixels. And we will, actually the easier way to do this, I'm delete the other one. I'm just going to duplicate this red one. And I'm going to change the settings on the duplicated version. to be on the right side. We'll go to the modifier stack, and for the green, we'll leave the green channel down. We'll take the blue channel up, but we're going to take the red channel down. So now I've got each one of these cropped a little bit, so as you get further to the edge, it crops out on either side here. And if I set both of these to an add blend mode, you can see what we get. Now we get this glowing effect with some chromatic aberration. If I duplicate it, or if I render that out, you can see red on the left, blue on the right. Now it's really, really intense. So I might turn them down a little bit. So on these strips, I might set the opacity to 0.2. 0.2. So now it's a little bit more subtle. But we can see that effect. So you get a little bit of a red on one side, blue on the other. So yeah, you can composite in here just like you would on any other two-dimensional compositor. Let's turn on our other effects. Let's see what our final output is. Refresh the sequencer. And there's one frame. So I could render all of this out. Now, what I promised you at the beginning of all of this was a look at how procedural it was. So let's take a look at that very quickly. Now, if you remember, the text existed back at the beginning of this whole thing. We had some text images where we had our original text set. So if we go back to the default view and we go to the text strip, and we're only going to change it once. We're going to change the text one time and then render out our frames very quickly. So if I tab into edit mode and I change this now to another logo like that, and let's edit this a little bit so it looks a little bit better. Change our letter spacing. And then we render this out. So I'm going to render one frame from here, and for this image, I'll save as image, as text. And then we'll go to the other versions here. Text blur. If you remember, this is in the video sequence editor. Text blur. Whoops. And it's already updated here. All I need to do is render out a frame. Text blur. And then we'll go to our last one, which was text reflect. It's already updated. And we'll render out one frame. And there we've got it. So now, if I go back to my composite, you see that it still says hello. Let me save the file very quickly. Now this is really neat. If I click on refresh sequencer, it won't do anything. But that's because the texture and material, the textures and materials have not been updated. They have been cached into RAM. Now, the quick and easy way to do this is once you've saved it, to then just reopen the copy again. So I'm just going to reopen my file. And now you can see that everything is set. My entire project has been procedurally updated. So you only need to change the text once and then render out those frames that you've used, and then everything will be updated once you reopen the project. So now I can render out from here. If I render one frame, this is what I get, and I get my full resolution composite. So again, we're using scenes as if they are pre-composed portions of an After Effects project in order to do this. So there's a lot of applications for this we're going to be looking at in the future, but I just wanted to share this idea with you that you can learn a great deal from a lot of other tutorials. You just have to think about, how does Blender work? How does Blender use those functions? How can I use those functions inside of Blender to get essentially the same result? And then you can come up with results that look a lot like what you've been taught from people in various different platforms. So good luck with this. I wish you the best of luck with these different kinds of techniques and kind of thinking through this and trying some of these experiments out. And I wish you, of course, happy blending.